Hello, welcome to HallowZine 2024. Today I am joined by Josh Domanski and Zach Vaupen, who are from Liminal Horror, and they're going to be talking all about the fun of running horror game genre, scary, you name it. We're going to be talking about that for TTRPGs and best advice for how to play them, and we're going to talk a little bit about just horror movies and fun costumes and stuff in general. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. But first of all, maybe I can just throw it out there. Josh, why don't you maybe start us off and introduce yourself, and then we'll move over to Zach.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having us this year. As you said, I'm Josh. I do a little bit of writing and design in the tabletop RPG scene here. Again, most commonly known for Liminal Horror, but I dabble in little bits and bobs. You may have seen my stuff in a few other things here and there, but that's the big one. That's why we're here to talk about it.
Cool. And Zach.
Hey everyone, I'm Zach Hazard Vaupen. I'm an artist for tabletop RPGs. Occasionally I get to write my own too, but you may have seen my work in obviously Liminal Horror. I've done most of the artwork throughout the series so far and have recently stepped into the role of being the full-time art director for everything Liminal Horror going forward. I've also worked on Mothership and tons of other stuff I'm sure you've seen.
And for those that are unfamiliar with Liminal Horror, I have like the original version here, which is fantastic. And that was a really good kind of launching point into, for me, like nice, friendly, quick and easy to the table horror games. And let's just talk quickly about Liminal Horror just to give everybody a grounding into your experience and how you've developed it. So first of all, Liminal Horror, just tell us the framework that Liminal Horror is based upon.
Yeah, sure. So Liminal Horror was originally created by Goblin Archives, who wasn't able to make it here today. I believe it was 2020 when it first came out, but don't quote me on that. I ended up joining the team a little later when we developed what is technically the second module, the Bureau here. But Liminal Horror, at its core, it's a rules-light survival horror tabletop RPG. It is based originally off of Cairn, and Cairn itself pulls heavily from Into the Odd and Knave, among other systems. But we took that core, or I should say Goblin Archives mostly, took that core and spun it a little bit to kind of dial it in for contemporary horror. We say modern horror, but that's really anything from about 1970s to now-ish. A lot of the stuff that we write in terms of like the official modules is more focused on like right now, as opposed to some of the like Call of Cthulhu is very 1920s focused, but we do have them all, which is up here now, which is focused on the 90s, and there's not really a whole lot of changes you need to make if you want to put this back in the 70s or 80s either. It's really just ditch your cell phone and then you're pretty much good to go. But yeah, we're flipping through since the original release. There have been, oh boy, I think it's 4 formal modules. We have a couple of pamphlets that we, I guess, commissioned, if you want to call it that. Zach wrote one of them as well. And then we have a little like crossover adventure with the folks from Haunted Table for Triangle Agency. But a ton of little supplemental supporting things at this point, each coming out, I don't know, every 6 to 8 months, I think we've been shooting for since the original release. And we also have the Investigators edition, which is sort of the current version of the zine that we're printing. The original one that Gary showed was we're calling that the Legacy edition. That was the first formal zine that was put out, and then this Investigators edition is a little bit of a stopgap where we are currently working on what's called the Deluxe edition. The idea being that we're going to be blowing out the zine into like a 200-page book, mostly the same in terms of like the core mechanics and whatnot, a few teeny tiny tweaks to the system, but everything being sort of backwards compatible. And then the rest of the book is just blown out into a bunch of tools and stuff to bring horror to your own tables. So the Investigator edition is that original zine cleaned up a little bit. We've got the updates here. It's a little better layout, a little better text. We added a couple small little subsystems here, wounds being the biggest one. And then this is what the system will look like, going forward as we work on the deluxe edition.
And I really like the way that it's evolved, because you started off with Goblin Archives, and then Josh, you were doing some good work within the space, and then it was an obviously good partnership. And Zach, obviously, you've been working alongside them, and now it's like chocolate, peanut butter, and whatever third ingredient we want to add into it. So Zach, what's your approach to liminal horror and like kind of the art that you like to include?
I mean, honestly, it's kind of just like whatever I want to draw. I think what Nick or Goblin Archives originally contacted me, a couple years ago to do the cover for the original Liminal Horror zine, and it was kind of just here's the contents. Can you just make a cover for this? And so I just I read it, thought about what it evoked, thought about what would be fun, scary stuff for me to draw. And that's sort of what ended up being the cover. And it's sort of been, I generally try my best to like get in the heads of what Josh and Goblin are trying to do. But I also just try to think about what's going to be fun for me to draw and what I think is going to be fun for people to look at.
Very cool. Well, I think you're doing a great job, and it's a great team, and I'm looking forward to kind of seeing how it all gels together. Like I said, chocolate, peanut butter, and let's add that third ingredient here now. Before we get started in the show, the history of HallowZine, I think it was like maybe 2 years ago, I did 31 zine reviews in 31 days, and I was joined by my friend here, and he has his own voice. And I really enjoyed that process of Beanie joining me for that 31 days. However, it was a hell of a job. And I did 31 zine reviews in 31 days, and I said never again. So with that said, I'm happy to just do these kind of one-offs for the year. And previously, we had Logar Hale Crom join me. And so hopefully we can make this a bit of a Halloween tradition that we can build on year after year. But part of that live cast that we did with Logar, we asked the question of what is your favorite horror movie and why? So let's start off with Zach. What is your favorite horror movie and why?
Okay, so I had to think about this for a bit because I'm very bad at favorites. I'm very much like the typical fickle artist that's always just looking for like the next inspiration. But things I go back to a lot are stories where reality completely fails everybody. Like there's just no way out, So I think the movies that I tend to, I managed to narrow it down to a top three. In the Mouth of Madness, John Carpenter, Perfect Blue, and Existenz. Those are three where just, the deeper you get into it, the less reality around you makes sense. There's nothing to grab onto, and that's the scariest thing to me.
And Josh, how about yourself?
In the Mouth of Madness is also on my list. So again, my favorite horror movie all time is Alien, but that's kind of like boring to talk about because everybody talks about it. Alien is like the perfect horror movie, so boring. Blah. So in the Mouth of Madness was one that I liked, and again for similar reasons, where it just kind of hits on all levels. It starts fairly mundane and slowly unravels over the course of the movie. I think all of like the horror itself still really holds up in the modern era here. But two others I wanted to quickly talk about here. One is more of like I really like this movie, and the other is just a really good movie to watch for Halloween. The first is Jacob's Ladder. That is another one where it's reality starts to slowly unravel. Where if the viewers here, if you haven't seen it, go watch Jacob's Ladder. Like that, I cannot recommend it more. Where the idea is you have a veteran of the Vietnam War, I believe, who is suffering with trying to come back to normal life, after witnessing these horrific events. And things just kind of go a little wild. His reality starts to unravel over the course of the movie, and then you get to the end and the context all sorts to kind of make sense. I don't want to dive too deeper than that because it's very much a spoiler, and this is a movie to go in fairly blind beyond that just initial intro there. But it's also worth noting that Jacob's Ladder was a huge influence apparently on the Silent Hill series. If there are going to be a few things that Silent Hill fans will notice almost immediately upon their occurrence in the movie, and that'll all kind of start making sense here. The other one I want to quickly talk about is Bram Stoker's Dracula. I don't necessarily think it's like the best movie ever, but it's got such good vibes. It's a stellar cast. It's got Keanu Reeves and probably his worst acting job he's ever done, completely out of fit. But the visual aspects of the movie, so the sort of gothic horror, I do think it is a really good take on Dracula itself and how that all kind of intertwines together. But yeah, In the Mouth of Madness, Jacob's Ladder, and Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992 specifically. Those are my three.
Well, I love Jacob's Ladder, and Danny Aiello was like such the perfect relief to the tension that was always being built up when he would give the main character, I forget his name, it doesn't matter, when he'd give them the chiropractic massages and the release of that. He was the chiropractor in the show. And it's funny, I think a lot of people are just rediscovering Jacob's Ladder. I'm a little bit older than you, and for me that was like a really formative movie. I remember like lots of people just loving that. And then it kind of just went away. It was kind of like a little bit of a sleeper that stuck around for like a long time. I've only noticed a lot of people rediscovering it kind of in the last like 5 or 6 years. So great movie. Do check it out. I have to say, similarly to you, Josh, I love The Thing. I think it like Aliens, it's like an awesome, just kind of horror genre movie. So boring to talk about. Everybody loves that show, but it's great. But more recently, and I have to say, I was a little bit surprised at this one, but it had all the camp and everything that I kind of love that comes along with horror movies. Is Late Night with the Devil, which featured, it was like a found footage where they did a live broadcast on Halloween in 1970s. So it's kind of got that, like I said, I'm a little bit older here. So I grew up watching these like Dick Cavett type late night shows that were like really cheesy and had like the weird backgrounds, like the 70s, 80s kind of backgrounds to it. And so throughout the night, they kind of mix in found footage, which normally I actually don't really like that genre because it's a little too shaky, but they did it really well because it was like a live broadcast, and they brought out, a girl that was possessed. They brought out a hypnotist, and it was just like a fun little romp and a little bit of a surprise of a show for me. So I saw it and I was like, oh, that kind of just was a fun Halloween kind of scary romp, and nothing too shocking about it. It was just kind of fun. Lots of good vibes to it. Have either of you seen that one?
No.
Great trailer too, because they have it almost like that Halloween trailer where it's got the fuzzy vinyl kind of sound to it, where they go, nice. In 1979 this was I wonder if I should, maybe I'll be able to find it and bring it up here because it's such a good trailer. Anyways, we're here to also talk about how to run horror games in general. And so if you have questions that you want to pose to Josh and Zach about like your approach to running horror games and like how you can like squeeze the most out of the actual genre, let's throw them into the chat. If you have questions, we'll be able to answer them. But let me start us off. Josh, and maybe in particular, you can start us off. How do you run horror at the table?
I warned Gary ahead of time that I have a little bit of a rant on this whole subject. I write for Liminal Horror. I do a little bit of system design in the background, and this is kind of like the space I exist within. So I'll tell you guys a secret. Game systems don't create horror in and of themselves. The idea of rolling a dice, blowing out a candle, pulling a block from a Jenga tower, these things aren't scary. If I roll a d20, add 10 versus a difficulty class or whatever, that act isn't scary. The game system isn't doing anything to create that horror divorced of its context. So when you look at a lot of horror games, this is kind of why they tend to be mechanically light. It's because it's the other aspects that sort of bring the horror. But the biggest thing is you will not have a horror experience at your table without your players buying into the fact that you're playing a horror experience. Just as you sit down to watch a horror movie to be scared, just as you open a book to read it, you are buying into the idea. You want to engage with this, and that's what you need. So you will not run successful horror at the table without your players having bought into the idea that they're going to be enjoying a horror experience. That's sort of step one. So is to set expectations. You can always interject horror into your fantasy or what have you, and then most of the time that works out pretty well. But if you're going to run, a slasher or anything like that, you need to have people invested in it. That kind of extends to their characters. They have to be invested in the fate of their characters. If I don't care about this person I'm playing, I don't care when they die. There's no sense of tension there. So what game systems themselves do really well is simulate tension, where, again, it's you're rolling that die. You care about the result of that because of the sense of tension it creates. Will my character live or die due to the the outcome of this roll of dice? So you're sort of building up anticipation up to the point where you roll the die, then the result happens and you kind of narrate it outward. So it's this ebb and flow that you're creating here. And that's what systems do really well. While I said that the games, they don't create horror, they do a really good job of creating tension. That's, again, why Dread, one of the most famous horror tabletop RPGs out there, because it uses the Jenga tower. The Jenga tower symbolizes the fragility of your characters' lives or what have you. And as you're pulling blocks out of there, that's a very tangible bit of tension you're creating, because you're to see that Jenga tower kind of teetering as you're pulling the block out of it. But that's all tension. That's not horror. Where the horror comes in is sort of the narrative elements of it. The consequences of those actions that your characters are doing. If Jason bursts out of the wall and cuts your character's arm off, that's horrifying. It's something tangibly bad happening to your character, but you need that sense of tension, that sense of buildup, and you need to have your players care about their characters. So you need the buy-in. So horror tends to work really well when you mix those elements. Something to build the tension, and then those bits of grotesque, the narrative aspects, the things that gross out your players in a fun way. And those things that happen to their characters that you don't want. That's why body horror is typically some of the most effective form of horror. It's because you can imagine your character and yourself suffering similar fates. If my character gets their arm cut off, like I just said, I can imagine that that's going to suck pretty bad. So that is a horrifying moment that we wish to, avoid.
Can I ask a quick question here?
Sure.
So, and we talked a little bit about this before the live stream starts. How can you have horror, or how do you solve the problem of people die, body horror, they lose a limb and that kind of stuff? Because that also kind of can impact gameplay, as far as when people die in in D&D or the standard fantasy. Just throw a new character in ASAP. Do you approach it like that? How do you kind of solve that problem of characters in horror movies typically don't go in the basement, okay, they're dead now, we need a new character? Do you solve it like that, or is how do you or do they become just basically meat sacks that go die and then a new character pops in?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different solutions to that. It's going to work different at every table, basically. But in a general sense, it depends on the game. If you're playing something like Paranoia, or you're running a funnel, you have, everybody's playing multiple characters or what have you. You're throwing bodies at the problems. Those are meat grinders. Lots of characters die, and that's sort of the inherent nature of the game. When you're playing the singular protagonists over the course of a horror session or campaign, Some of that comes down to good pacing. If maintaining that tension at the table is all about maintaining an ebb and flow, where if things are intense all the time, you're running a 4-hour session and it's bang, 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 bad things happening always, you start to kind of kill that sense of tension as your players are getting used to it. Everything is bad always, so why should they care about their character? So this is where, the ebb and flow comes in. You're slowly building tension up to a point where things break and bad stuff happens. So you want to kind of like work that into the time limits that you have within, reasonable, means. You don't necessarily want to railroad anyone in these horror scenarios, even though that feels like it might be a good thing to do. So I guess the key there is don't kill your player characters too early. If you want to build that tension, you want to make the threat sort of like immediately known. That's why you have your NPCs. You have your red shirts or what have you, the people that are around in the group that can be the ones that get killed immediately to kind of set that established sense of horror, if that's what you're going for, at least initially. And beyond that, it's useful to think of, the horror tropes that are present in the media that we, often seek to emulate with these type of experiences, where, again, these are your protagonists. At the end of your session, if you're running like a one shot, most of them are probably going to be dead, and that's fine. But if you think of like the protagonists in horror movies, a lot of them are getting sort of messed up over the course of the movie. You don't see your core protagonists or what have you die outright. They wouldn't be the protagonists if they died immediately. So you have that fail forward mentality. I think people like to refer to it in tabletop RPGs, where the big bad evil thing can burst in and it might not skewer the character immediately. It might damage them, it might cut off an arm, it might stab them, it might give them something to make things more difficult later on. But your protagonists, they do escape, they get away from the horror. The way that I like to think about it is that when you're trying to run a lot of these horror scenarios, your player characters aren't really supposed to be genre savvy, but the horrors are genre savvy. So they know how they should behave in these situations, and they're trying to be horrors. So it's something to keep in mind as you're running it. You want an ebb and flow. You want to establish the stakes, the things that are at risk. It's often life or death in horror scenarios, but killing everybody immediately is kind of boring. But and beyond that, it'll be useful as like a game master or a designer to think of ways to introduce new characters. The way I always say is to favor inclusion over realism. If you do have a player character that dies like an hour into a 4-hour session, whatever, just get them a new character and continue on. It's far better to have your player at the table doing something than to maintain perfect narrative reality. But beyond that, it's easy enough if you have a crew of NPCs kind of floating around. Just have the player take over one of the NPCs, and eventually you'll slowly get whittled down, and it'll be just the player characters at the end of the session. Everybody else is already dead or what have you. But that's a real easy way. You can also have, again, if you're doing like a one shot, a lot of systems will kind of bake in ways to do it where I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I've seen a few of them where your dead players or your players who have dead characters, they can contribute in other ways, like their ghost or spirit is still around, so they're still like actively involved, even if you're not funneling them into a new character immediately. So that's a lot of like system dependent as well. But favor inclusion over realism. Keep a crew of NPCs around if it's convenient. And if all else fails and you got 3 hours left, just make it a character.
And you kind of hinted at it, and it brought me to the other question of like, generally speaking, horrors, whether it's aliens or like, The Thing, there's a bit of a mystery there and that you're trying to solve as a character. And how do you approach mysteries? Like there's all, there's the three clue rule and things like that. How do you approach it in like your best practice for doing that?
There are different, philosophies in terms of how you want to run this. It really depends on what you want to do at the table. Again, this is all to cater to the experiences that you as players want to have. If you look at something like Call of Cthulhu, that's very much, investigation heavy. That's a system where you have to go find the right clues if you want the right clues. That's how you kind of propel forward. There's been a bit of a modern change. I say modern, but it's at least a decade old, where the shift is to make it so solving the mystery isn't really like the core goal as players. It's more of you're sort of telling the story of how your characters are solving this mystery. That's a big proponent of the Carve from Brindlewood games, where a lot of these games, they got the little like cozy aesthetic, especially something like Brindlewood Bay. But there are, underlying horrors that you're kind of facing off against over the course of your campaigns there. But the idea being that when you're playing one of these games, you're finding all of these clues, and then it's sort of like the players piece it together in a way that makes sense of the context of the story. So in the sense that the underlying mystery isn't quite as important as the act of finding the clues and then, coming up with the solution. The way that we like to do it with Liminal Horror is, Liminal Horror is an investigative tabletop RPG, but it's not about solving the mystery. It's about surviving the mystery. So when your characters are searching for clues, it's not really to piece together and gain knowledge. We're not really in the business of answering questions. We're in the business of making horror. So the way we set it up, your clues are tools. Your characters will find these things. They arm themselves with knowledge. You might not solve the mystery, but if you know parts and pieces, that might help you survive it. So you're not necessarily gathering the clues so you have the answers. You're gathering the clues to give you the tools to keep your characters alive as long as possible. This is sort of descendant from a philosophy from Sean McCoy of Mothership. It's called Survive, Solve, Save. With the general process there, you guys can find the blog post about it. I think it's Failure Tolerated is Sean's blog there. That's worth a read for any fan of horror, because it's a really good sort of tool for setting up your scenarios there, where the way that Sean describes it is your characters sort of have three options over the course of a investigation or mystery or scenario, whatever. You can survive it, you can solve the underlying mystery, or you can save those at risk from whatever the horror is. Under most circumstances, as players, you're going to be able to do one of those, just fine by the end of it. Maybe you can do a second one, or a part of a second one, but you're never going to be able to do all three of those.
One of the things that I always find interesting, and I've, just to do my own shameless plug here for the Bug Busters, I've been doing some play testing of Bug Busters, and it's kind of like, exterminators fighting a bug alien space threat. But it always amazes me when I've been doing the play test that they defer to like authority almost, where they're in it, and I'm like, okay, now you're fighting like space bugs that are trying to conquer the Earth secretly, and you're an exterminator. So that's the premise. And then they go, well, we should call the cops. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You are the cops. Like, you are, you're it. You are solving it. And then going back to your earlier thought of like, well, people have to buy into the genre of what they're doing. How do you kind of stop them from kind of going, oh, we got to just like escape this and get out and like kind of basically end the adventure, or like get help to end the adventure, like without railroading them, or at least like, kind of seemingly railroad them? Like, how do you kind of isolate them from those safety nets?
Yeah, I mean, part of that is coming to the understanding that as players, you're there to play a horror scenario, and you have to be the protagonist that pushes forward rather than the one that runs away, even if that's always the most sensible answer. If you can run away, get away, but we're playing horror. We're not playing, nothing. So you have to, as players, be willing to engage with it in some extent. But beyond that, there are some ways that you can kind of get around it. The easiest as a game master is to do the enclosed location. You are in this one building and it's all locked up and you can't get out. You have to engage with the horror now because otherwise you're stuck in this building. You can do, the Silent Hill method where everything's covered in fog in this big open city, and you can explore the city, but if you try to get out, you're just going to be wandering aimlessly in the fog, and that's not good. So some constraint is usually the easiest tool. Mothership does this very easily because you're in space. If you look at Haunting of Ipsilon 14 for Mothership the Panfoot here, you're on an asteroid. You kind of have to come up with some reason why they can't just fly away from the asteroid, but you are limited by the space with which you're set within. So that's the easiest.
That is a good module. I've run that a few different times, and it's like, for me, it's got such a nice setting that you can just throw characters into and like isolate them, and it's for such a small pamphlet. It's like beautifully crafted.
Yeah. And so constraints, it's good. Easiest one of the book is just throw some kind of either narrative or physical constraint to make sure your characters are contained within your setting. The second is a drive. This is, you give your characters a reason to dive further in and engage with the horror. We try and do this a little bit with Liminal Horror. Some of our more recent modules have, we're calling them archetypes, I believe, little built-in like character bits that you can use to see your character to kind of directly connect them with the horror itself, or with at least the space that the horror is taking place in. But if we look at, again, Silent Hill 2 is a good example. I won't spoil it beyond this, but Silent Hill 2, it's a 20-year-old game, but it has a new remake that just came out a few weeks ago at this point. Silent Hill, the one that James Sunderland is exploring, is a horrible, wretched, awful place. The most sensible thing is always going to be to leave, but James is there for a particular reason. He's there to find his wife. So everything in that game that is propelling you forward as you're going through these horrible, wretched, awful environments is because James has to be there to find his wife, to move through. So that's going to be, when you bring that to the table, you have to be a little careful about how that relates to your player characters. We can talk about it a little later, but we have the newest Liminal Horror module, Parthenogenesis of Hungry Hollow. We have provided a couple of leader starting scenarios to kind of get different tables worked in depending on how you wish to run the module. One of them is pretty direct. It's the player characters are supposed to start with an existing friendship with somebody who's kind of a key figure with the events that happen in the module. So you begin with this connection to the location and to the one of the central sort of antagonistic figures there. So you're going throughout the playtime, your players are theoretically going to be driven to find this person while all of these horrors are going on because of the friendship that they have. But it doesn't need to be so simple. A lot of the times horror is more of along the lines of connection to the location. Like if Stranger Things is a pretty decent one, or at least the first season, if we want to dive into that. But where these kids who are trying to solve this horror, they're doing it because they live in this town and they're trying to save this town. So again, that's another sort of narrative motivation, a drive in order to do so. So you've got your physical strengths, you have the drives of your characters, and that's usually enough. One or the other, it will kind of get you going and propel you forward on top of the player buy-in. But the third thing we were talking about earlier is, why not call the cops? That's sort of the biggest question, always the question lingering over modern horror scenarios. Pretty easy to answer. The first, if you don't want to deal with that, Get rid of cell phones.
That is a common thing, and that's I said bug busters in the 90s for that specific reason. Is that like cell phones destroy a lot of adventures if you can just Google things.
Yeah, and so that's easy, but we don't necessarily want easy. But get rid of the cell phones. You can either set it in the 90s, 80s, 70s, what have you, or put it in a place where cell service doesn't work anymore. Secluded locations are often good for horror, and that's a really good excuse for cell service to be shitty. So that's easy enough. Just get rid of your cell phones. They can't call the cops. But the other thing is, will the police be helpful in these scenarios? You call the police and tell them that you see this rabid monster with tentacles lingering in the shadows of the alleyway behind your building. Will they believe you? If they do believe you, how will they respond? Will they send somebody to go look at it? If they send a single officer to go look for this horror, that's a victim for the horror that you have right there. There you go. The officer's down. What do? Now you have a call and you're implicated in this disappearance of an officer. How does that scenario start to kind of spin out of control? Your players are now in more trouble in more ways than just the horror itself. So maybe the cop comes, maybe you convince them, maybe they believe you. There you go. You have an ally. How does that change the situation? Does it change it at all? How does that one cop convince the rest of the department that there is a horrible monster with tentacles hiding in the shadows of the alleyway there? So having cell phones, having access to being able to call the cops isn't really going to automatically win anything if your horror is good enough. That's another thing. Like if horror can be solved by the police, there is no real reason for your protagonists to be involved to begin with. So being able to call the police shouldn't really ever be much of a concern, and probably is going to cause more problems than it actually helps in the end of it.
Maybe this would be also a good time to talk about like stress mechanics in general. You could talk about Liminal Horror's stress mechanics, but famously there's like Call of Cthulhu, where people go crazy, quote unquote, type of thing. How do you in your games kind of ratchet up that stress through mechanics?
Yeah, I guess it's easy to start with Liminal Horror. Liminal Horror has I don't think it's necessarily wholly unique system, but the one sort of creative spin that it takes on the core frame that was borrowed from to bring it forward here is how stress and fallout work. Typically, you will have in systems where you gain stress and it slowly builds up and up and up and up until you hit to a certain threshold and a bad thing triggers. And you think of, Mothership, you build stress. Stress in and of itself doesn't really do anything up until the point where you need to make a panic check. But then when you make that panic check, stress becomes kind of important and dictates how your character might respond to a situation. That's good. I like how Mothership does it. I think their stress mechanic works well for the system that it has there. But for Liminal Horror, what we do is stress directly targets your character's hit protection. Hit protection being your hit points, effectively, but it's your ability to avoid serious harm. So this is sort of physical harm and as well as the mental stress by being in these scenarios. So stress targets HP just as damage does. The key here is once HP is depleted, whenever you gain damage or stress, it starts targeting your stats directly. So if you take physical damage, you start losing your strength score. Your character gets a little weaker as they're being, bodily beat up. And then as you're mentally sort of worn down with stress there, it starts targeting your control score. Control being the stat that affects your ability to, handle the strange things that you're kind of occurring there. It's also a little bit of a social stat, though we don't get too deep into that with Liminal Horror. So once stress hits your control, you have to make a new save with this lowered control score. If that save has failed, you gain fallout. Now, fallout are the tangible mechanical effects of the horrors on your player characters, where you start to become a little bit like the horrors you're facing, where as your body is worn down and beat up, you're slowly starting to change. And this is where the body horror of Liminal Horror comes in. Fallout make you a little stronger. It is the only form of direct mechanical character progression in the game, but they make you a little weirder, and it consumes one of your inventory slots, and you only get 10 of those. So as you're diving into these horrors, your character is getting whittled away. You can carry less tools to solve your problems, but you're starting to change, become new, become something, different than what you started at over the course of this scenario. So stress isn't really building, it is harming your character in a more direct manner.
This might be a good chance to allow Josh to clear his throat, and before we start to get into the other parts of what games could you play for Halloween and leading up to it. But the question I have now, let's take a little bit of a break here. Zach, what was your favorite Halloween costume growing up, or in current standards, costuming in general?
So I explained this a little bit before we started streaming, but my parents were very cheap with Halloween costumes, so I wasn't really raised to dress up for Halloween very often. I did dress up for Halloween every year as a kid, but it was I think my parents got me a Grim Reaper costume one year when I was 5 or 6 years old. The next year, they just got me a Jason mask. So I wore the cloak from the Grim Reaper costume with a Jason mask. The next year, they got me a Freddy claw. So I had built up this character that is the Grim Reaper, but with the Jason mask and the Freddy Krueger claw.
An amalgam of...
So but basically, I really only had one costume that just evolved over the course of my entire childhood. And then as an adult, I just completely lost interest. I think every Halloween, the most I do is if I'm going to a party or something, I just borrow my wife's eyeliner and just draw stuff all over my face, usually a bunch of fake eyes or something like that, just something to be able to go out and say, yeah, I did something.
And were your parents the type that went along with you during the trick-or-treating and then checked your candy after, or were you one of the wild kids that basically just had free reign to just run amok, throw eggs, etc.?
I did have the freedom to run amok if I wanted to. I think when I was really small, my parents went around with me, but I grew up in a condominium complex, so I really wasn't going to be going more than I don't know, a few blocks away from my house ultimately, because there was 100 different houses in my little cul-de-sac. So I was mostly just going around to those. Every once in a while, a friend would invite me to go to their neighborhood, and we, maybe get into a little bit of mischief. But I didn't want to do too much of that too locally, because everyone in my neighborhood knew me because it was also close knit.
And Josh, yourself, we have some newer costumes, but I'll pop those onto the screen quickly here.
Oh, sure.
You can. You seem to like your costumes.
Yeah. Halloween's probably my favorite holiday. I think it's a pretty easy top tier for me. When I was growing up, my grandmother was really into Halloween, and she'd go all out. The whole front of the yard is decorated, and not necessarily in the make the house a haunted house type of deal. But she'd wear a costume and what have you. And my grandparents lived in, I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and there's a part of the city that's called the Valley. It's I think it's a working class neighborhood is the best way to describe it, but it is, in a valley from the city kind of descends down there from the university side and the rest of the Syracuse. But that neighborhood was full of a flood of kids, like I said, it was a working class neighborhood. So families were kind of moving there and, raising their children there. So my grandparents' house would get flooded every year with kids, and we're talking like hundreds of them, because everybody would be funneled down into this neighborhood. Everybody in Syracuse needed to go to the valley for Halloween, and so everyone would flood down into there. She would prepare every year and still run out of candy and be like grabbing stuff out of the kitchen to give
Here's
to
some
these
tuna,
kids. By the end of the night. And so she was really into it, and that kind of bled over into us. We did costumes every year. I wish I had some of the pictures. A lot of those, because this was the 90s, a lot of them are still physical pictures developed on film. They're currently 3,000 miles away from me, so I don't have access to them. And a LimeWire virus from the 2000s took out our external drive, so I don't know how much survived our pictures. So,
LimeWire. Oh, that's a blast from the past.
yeah, it's kind of nuts. The virus we got on one computer infected an external drive, which it apparently wasn't supposed to be able to do back then. And then that external drive infected like 2 or 3 other computers and like bricked everything. So we lost a lot, unfortunately, but I do have a few pictures here from for more recent times. But
well, first of all, I have to say, like, fuck, you're pretty buff here. Like, I only see your head up on the screens normally, but I'm looking at these and going, like, the face hugger one in particular, you look like you could like rip that thing off yourself.
I used to be a hockey player, if that helps.
Oh, really? I used to play hockey too.
Yeah, my family were real big into funneling us into sports, so I did 4 seasons of it when I was a childhood up until the end of high school. So.
Oh, right on.
But costumes, let's see. The ones I remember back in like 99, my brothers and I did a lot of Star Wars stuff. So I remember vividly Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn character costumes that we had as little, like, I don't know how old we would have been at that point, 7 or 8, something like that. I had this costume that I wore a few years. It was the Black Knight from Monty Python, where one of the arms was off, and so it was just like a cloth fabric you'd put over yourself and like have one arm dangling by your side. But that got a lot of use. I know I did that a few years. The ones I have here, I did Two-Face. That would have been, I think it was 2017 was that Two-Face costume. That is like hands down the favorite one I've ever done. That was,
what is that on your face? How did you do that?
So my now wife, at the time we had just started been dating about a year, I think, at that point.
And that sealed the deal, this Two-Face.
Yeah. So she's a social worker, but at one point wanted to go to school for cosmetology. And so was like really into that. And specifically, she wanted to do special effect makeup. And so this was far simpler than it looks. It's just like spirit gum and tissue that's kind of like wadded up onto my face. And then we went over with, I think it was red paint underneath and a black layer on top, something like that. But this is even, this picture is 3 or 4 hours into the night when it started to look a little worse, but it was pretty damn good, it turned out. But the other two we have here, I've got the Last Jedi costume for Rey that I hodgepodged myself. And then there is Kane from Alien. That was last year's. I think we're doing Kermit and Miss Piggy this year for Halloween, but we still got to get on that. And we got a couple of days, so we'll see.
Lots of time. And speaking of which, that was in my childhood. My mom, bless her heart, would always like think of like me as far as, okay, I'm going to get them a good costume. And I often would like kind of like not plan things as a kid. And so my mom would make these like really, I think, incredible costumes that would also keep me warm because I'm up here in Canada. So trick-or-treating for us is not a kind of a warm activity often. There's snow on the ground at points. So like I remember one year she made me like a lion costume. And it was like so nice and so good. I was like, I can't wear this. My friends are going to make fun of me. And so my poor mom goes through all this work, and like probably 9 times out of 10, at the end of it, I go, I can't wear this clown costume. It's like too good. It's too like, so I'd go as a hobo and I'd like rummage through their closet and pick some stuff up and put some like black stuff on my face, or a hockey player. Speaking of hockey, I'd go in and raid my hockey equipment and wear that out. And so my poor mom, year after year, would like labor. And so I was probably the worst kid ever. And I'd kill my kid if that was me now. But anyways, I grew up in the kind of 80s, and that scene in E.T. when all the kids are out trick-or-treating that one night, like that was kind of my era of, we grew up in a small town on the edge of the woods. And so for us, like E.T. and that trick-or-treating scene in there was like exactly the way I remember it growing up, except colder, because, you know, up here in Canada, we don't have the nice warm weather that other places do, although I suspect Syracuse didn't have it much better.
No, Syracuse is one of the snowiest cities in the country, if not the world. So
cool. Well, that was a nice blast from the past. Let's kind of get in. We've talked now how to kind of run horror movies, some common pitfalls that you might want to try to, or not horror movies, horror games, some pitfalls that you might want to avoid and how to kind of overcome them. Josh, what do you have as far as some suggestions as other games that you could play, some other adventures that you go, okay, these are bangers for Halloween, like you should run them?
yeah, so I've got a few collected around me here. The idea is, these are things, if you want to run something for Halloween this year, pick them up, or, well, at least look into them. First and foremost, if I want to shill a little bit, look up Liminal Horror.
All the links are going to be in the description and the show notes, so go buy them. You can get them through Drive-Thru RPG, Itch. You can download them for digital, so even if you can't get them in your hot little hands, you can still download them and play them. And Liminal Horror has a free version, which you can download at any point too.
Yeah, it's you can find it on the website. It's liminalhorrorrpg.com. We just got the domain.
Oh, right on.
But some of the more recent modules, it's, you know, the Bloom, the Bureau, and Hungry Hollow. In the beginning of it, we have little bits of advice on how to run them as a one-shot. These are all, you know, multi-session, you know, modules if you are to run them purely as written, but you can break little bits and pieces off of them to, you know, do singular experiences. And I've done so. We've got little like tech demos, so to speak, for each of the modules that we can run. They're all sort of one shots based on the scenarios there. So it's a very reasonable thing to do. Or even if you already own them, it's easy to pull parts out just to run for one night. This was written by Zach. This is The Chair. This is one of our Tales from the Void pamphlet series that we did. Oh man, I think it was almost 2 years ago at this point.
Maybe this would be a good time. Zach, tell us about this adventure.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a haunted house adventure, sort of. It's more of a haunted chair adventure. It's you end up by various means inside of a house you can't get out of. You don't really know how you got there. You can't figure out how to get out. Everything, the windows don't open, the doors are all locked. They can't be smashed for whatever reason, but you are greeted with a chair that just looks like it's from hell. Just the worst, ugliest, scariest, least, I don't know, I want to say appetizing, but not appetizing. Whatever sitting in something would be for appetizing. It's the least that, and you have to figure out by going through, you know, all the different rooms, which all have different obstacles and things to survive, and things that are just very, very strange and unusual. You have to figure out how to get out of this house and how to survive the menace of the chair. And it's just a short adventure. It's like 6 rooms, and you could easily play it in a one-shot, like 2 or 3 hour session.
Is that your only adventure, or do you have more in the liminal horror space?
It's my only adventure so far. I have a lot cooking, but nothing done. I'm focused mostly on getting the art done for the deluxe edition right now. And then also I'm working on a side project with Exalted Funeral called Frog World, which is a Morkborg adventure that I'm making with Micah Anderson.
And I completely blew this. You guys are going to give away 3 copies. I should have probably mentioned this right off the beginning, but we can do this post event. So if people want to, Josh, tell us what they're going to get. There's 3 copies you're going to give away.
Yeah, we got some spare copies of the Parthenogenesis of Hungry Hollow. They are the versions that are slightly dinged up, not enough to harm the product, but to the point where we don't want to sell them, but we can give them away. So we got 3 of them at this point. How do we want to choose them?
Well, since like we don't have a lot of comments flowing, what I think we should do is this YouTube video that people are watching. Why don't you just comment on your favorite horror movie, and in the comments, and then maybe on Halloween we'll do a draw from all the people that have commented, and then we'll follow up with 3 winners from that from the YouTube video. So if you are listening to this on Spotify, or if you're watching this live on Instagram, go to the YouTube channel at Daiku Games, all one word, and go there, comment what is your favorite Halloween movie to be entered in the draw, and then we'll follow up with you afterwards to let you know that you've won, and we'll do that draw. I'll figure something out on Halloween, and we'll do that draw, and then I'll pass the names along to Josh and Space Penguin Inc., who is your publisher. And you guys can send it. So once again, these are maybe a little bit dinged up copies, so but they're made with love. So
yeah, I think it's really just like slight corner bends and stuff, nothing detrimental to the actual product itself, but yeah, hardcover versions of the current module that we're working on trying to sell.
And this might be another good opportunity to kind of step in and just talk about the future of liminal horror. And if people are going, you know what, I've always wanted to design a horror adventure, but I didn't really want to make rules. Like that's not my jam. I just want to make an adventure. Tell us about how they can do it for a liminal horror adventure.
So this is coincidentally a really good time to kind of jump on in if you want to make something specifically for liminal horror, or just horror in general. What we are currently in the middle of is a game jam over on itch.io. It's called the Horrors of the Americas Jam, where we are encouraging people to pick a location in the US and write, or well, in all of the Americas, not just the US, I should say, and write a little bit about it. This could be a scenario, it could be a single monster, it could be some NPCs, it could be a location to explore, something like that. Just something a little small. We're looking for short form content here, and put it out there. The idea in the end is we're going to eventually collect them all together, those who consent to it at least, into a like a soft cover print on demand book. A tour of the Americas, so to speak, from the horror perspective. But I mentioned this because we have a ton of tools and people willing to help on our Discord server. If you're able to find the link to the game jam, hopefully we can get that over to Gary so it gets put in the little blurb below. There's a whole bunch of stuff we got hosted over there. The big thing is the Liminal Horror website has I think it's the annotated archive of game design resources that'll help you kind of get started on ways to begin writing and publishing your adventures. The jam itself, we did a little template for Liminal Horror that kind of sets you up with some affinity tools in order to get the stuff that you write down onto the page, but there's also some tips and tricks on what to write baked within that template itself. And again, we have a Discord server. We got, I think they're 400, 500 people at this point. A lot of them are really willing to help you work through your ideas and get it to the point where it's, either bring it to your table or publishing, whatever you really want to do with it. But it is a great time to get started in the general sense. So please come join us there.
And Zach, from an art perspective, like, you're doing, like, you've got that chair pamphlet. It's not, and these are kind of smaller kind of adventures. Just talk to us, like, how easy would it be to, like, maybe find some public domain art or something like that, and like put together a module with the templates?
Oh yeah, it would be so easy. There's plenty of resources out there for public domain art. There's lots of artists that have art that they have royalty free. I have my own art pack that I try to like have it go on sale at least once a year. That has a ton of stuff in it that you could use for your adventures completely royalty free. Yeah, I mean there's lots of options out there.
Cool. And then from like the mood and the genre of liminal horror, and I know it's not like completely locked in, and it doesn't have to be a certain way, and that's the beauty of it. It's very much like Mothership. People bring their own kind of style to it. But as far as like what you've got going forward, as far as the art direction of liminal horror, kind of just talk to us about the mood that you're trying to set for the system.
I think I mean I really like to focus on the body horror aspects. Like Josh was saying earlier, body horror is such a big part of like, what creates horror for players in this type of game. So a lot of that, a lot of like mood and tension and stuff I like to put in the art and into the art direction. I want to make sure that not everything is clear, that I'm not, we're not telling you what the adventure is supposed to look like. We're just trying to tell you what it feels like.
And I mean, going to the name liminal horror and like liminal spaces and that kind of thing, it's just that kind of eerie feeling of it not being a natural space for you.
Exactly.
So it's just unsettling and odd feelings inside. And if you can invoke that in your characters or players, probably more importantly, then you get that suspense and tension that you're trying to achieve. The future of liminal horror, to kind of close things off here, the future of liminal horror, how do you see it going? Like, I know obviously Karen has now got a lot of followers and people building in the space, and you're trying to essentially kind of recreate that kind of community for people to develop and share their stories.
Yeah, this has been an interesting couple of years here. Seeing we're trying pretty hard to sort of foster the sense of community there. One, because it helps us sort of intrinsically, but two, because it's also really cool to see a lot of the stuff that folks are bringing to the table. We did a game jam last year. Trying to remember how many entries I got. I got like a ton of them. Just people putting little things together. We got like full zines from it. We were really trying to make that a repository for a lot of like the third party stuff. But this year we have done a couple of other game jams where we're trying to build it up. Again, the idea is like, we know a lot of people have really cool ideas. What can we do to help them get them to the table? Even if it's not for liminal horror, we still want to see them because they're cool. So we did the Twisted Classics Jam earlier this summer, where the idea was to recreate a story that you like, rebuild it from the ground up, and write it in a manner that can be used at the table. So it's not necessarily about taking a movie or a book or an adventure and directly writing it for liminal horror. It's about taking inspiration from that and making it your own. So that game jam went on, like I said earlier this summer. We got, I think it was 30 entries that weren't from the team themselves. But there was some really, really cool stuff in there. So we want to foster that creativity there. That's a big goal of ours. It helps building a community, but it's building an active community is kind of our goal here. Even if it is just a couple hundred people that are still making stuff, that's still really cool to see. That's the whole point of the current jam that we just talked about, the Horrors of the Americas, where we just want to see people making cool stuff. There's not really much in it for us other than that. Like it's more important to build sort of the active community rather than having a bunch of fans who passively view it, even though that is nice, but being able to get with folks and do creative things and help them bring their products to reality has been a pretty good joy so far the last couple of years, and things are moving forward in that direction.
Well, very cool. And if you're in Mexico, Chupacabra, he said it's Americas, so let's
we do really want some stuff from like not just the US. That's the big thing, is we want to encourage it. We just have a there is a Spanish translation of Liminal Horror that I believe just released. That's done through the third-party license, so we're not directly involved in that. But there have been a couple of Spanish language adventures that have been put out. I don't know much Spanish, but it's cool to see them.
Cool. Well, before we go, I did talk about Late Night with the Devil, and I brought it up here, and let me see if I can bring it up. And I don't know if the audio is going to work, and I also don't know, and why I'm waiting to this point to like share it is because you never know if YouTube's going to shut you down for a copyright violation. So I'm going to play it, and if we get copyright hit and bumped, I guess thanks for joining in to the show. But if not, I'll be right back. But it's only a minute long, but just check this out. I really love the vibe of it, and tell me if the audio is not working for it.
On Halloween night, 1977, America gathered around for a live TV event that shocked the nation. What happened was real. What you are about to see is the recently discovered master tape of what went to air that night.
Is Mr.
Ladies and
Late Night with the Devil.
So, like I said, it was like a fun little romp. You should check it out. Just and I normally, like I said, found footage. I like the concept of it and the idea of it, but rarely does it kind of work. It's always like shaky cam. But because it was in a live studio audience, it was just a fun little romp. But anyways, I'm glad we didn't get copyright hit, or at least not immediately. But for those that have joined us and are watching and listening at home, have a happy Halloween, and thank you for joining us for HallowZine 2024. Hopefully we can make this kind of a more of an annual thing and just talk about horror and everything to get some cool games to the table in the horror genre, and really look forward to seeing the future of Liminal Horror and all the games that can kind of come from the community.
Yeah, well, thank you for having us this year.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And so before we go, Beanie says thanks for joining us. I have had so much fun creeping my kids out with this. I'd often like leave Beanie under their covers before they go to bed and that kind of thing. But they're like 21, so they can handle it now. But as always, I know this wasn't an official game pitch, but if you are an indie game designer and you got a liminal horror adventure or anything like that you want to share on my podcast, I love indie games. I love indie designers. There's no D&D here. And if you're interested, go to daikugames.com/gamepitch and tell them Game Pitch Gary sent you, or today, Bugbuster Billy. And until next year, have a happy Halloween.
Hey friends, are you looking for a game that is not Dungeons or Dragons? Well, we got exactly what you need at Daiku Game Pitch. We got zines, we got OSR, we got adventures. But wait, there's more. We got solo games, we got journaling games, we even got card games and dice games. Oh hell, I don't even know what kind of game this is, but we got it. And if you visit us in the next 2 minutes, you're gonna get all the Zine Quest, Zine Months, Itch Fund and Backer Kits, Kickstarters that you can handle. Visit us at www.daikugames.com and tell them a Game Pitch Gary sent ya.